The hallway behind the main stage was narrow and quiet compared to the storm of noise echoing through the rest of the building. Lights hummed softly overhead, and the polished floor reflected the movement of people rushing past intersections further down. Steve Harvey walked alone, his jacket perfectly pressed, his mind buried in last-minute details, timing cues, jokes he might cut or keep. He had hosted countless major events by this point, but the hours before a live broadcast always carried the same weight. Every step mattered, every second was accounted for. He was halfway down the corridor when someone stepped directly into his path and stopped him cold. She was young, clearly nervous, hands clenched at her sides like she was holding herself together through sheer will. For a split second, Steve felt the familiar instinct to apologize, to move around her, to keep walking. But then she looked up and her eyes weren't asking for a photo or an autograph. They were asking for permission to be heard. She opened her mouth and said 5 simple words. Nothing dramatic, nothing rehearsed. Just the truth stripped bare. You inspired me to dream. Something inside Steve cracked so suddenly it caught him off guard. The hallway seemed to shrink. The noise of the building faded. Those words landed somewhere far deeper than compliments ever do, because they carried the weight of survival, not admiration. 3 minutes later, both of their lives were moving in directions neither of them could have predicted. Months earlier and thousands of miles away, that same girl had been waking up before sunrise in a crowded children's home on the outskirts of Manila. Her days followed a rigid rhythm: shared bathrooms, shared meals, shared everything. Privacy was a luxury she'd never known. She had been there since she was a small child, old enough to remember her mother's face, but too young to understand why she never came back. She knew the story because it had been told to her enough times that it stopped feeling like a story at all. Her mother died giving birth to her. Her father brought her to the home when she was 5, promising he would return once he figured things out. He never did. Years passed then, more years, until the idea of a family became something she only saw in other people's lives. The home wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was practical. Beds lined the walls. Clothes were handed down until the fabric thinned. Dreams were not encouraged, not discouraged, just quietly ignored. Most of the older kids left at 18 and disappeared into whatever jobs would take them. That was the path laid out in front of her, narrow and unremarkable. But she was different in one important way. She imagined something else. The moment that changed everything didn't come with fanfare. A volunteer arrived one afternoon carrying an old laptop with a cracked corner and a charger that only worked if you bent it just right. Internet access was limited and slow, but for her, it felt like someone had opened a window in a room she hadn't realized was suffocating her. She clicked through videos with curiosity until she stumbled onto a man talking about failure, rejection, sleeping in his car, and choosing faith over fear when logic said quit. It wasn't comedy that held her attention. It was honesty. He spoke about being invisible before anyone knew his name, about holding onto a dream when there was no evidence it would ever work. She listened like her life depended on it, because in some quiet way it did. She replayed those words again and again, memorizing them, letting them settle into her bones. When nights were long and the future felt like a locked door, she repeated them to herself like a prayer. Slowly a dream formed that felt both ridiculous and necessary. She didn't want wealth or fame for their own sake. She wanted to be seen so she could help others be seen too. She learned that pageants weren't just about beauty. They were microphones. They were stages. They were chances to speak to people who never listened to girls like her. When she shared this dream, most people smiled politely or laughed outright. Girls from places like this didn't end up on stages. They aged out quietly, but belief once planted is stubborn. When a scout noticed her during a charity visit, it felt unreal. Not because of validation, but because opportunity had finally found her address. She worked relentlessly, studying language, practicing interviews, standing straighter even when no one was watching. Small competitions led to bigger ones, and somehow, impossibly, she won a national title that still felt too heavy to hold. 4 months later, she stood backstage at an international competition, surrounded by women who looked like confidence had always belonged to them. She felt small again, like the girl on the creaking bunk bed. But she also remembered every night she had refused to give up. And she remembered the man whose voice had carried her through it. She knew she couldn't leave without telling him. Fear didn't disappear. It just lost the argument. She watched his routine, waited for the moment when the hallway would be empty, and stepped forward when it came. When she spoke those 5 words, she wasn't asking for anything. She was returning something he had given her without ever knowing her name. Steve listened as her story spilled out, raw and unpolished. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush her. He saw himself in her uncertainty, her hunger, her refusal to surrender. When she told him her age, her past, and why she was there, the dam broke. He cried the way people cry when something reminds them why the struggle was worth it. He held her like a father who understood what it meant to arrive somewhere, without anyone to bring you. He told her she had already won in ways trophies could never measure. He promised her support, not out of pity, but out of respect. That night, she didn't take the crown, but she took something more enduring. Her voice reached millions. People listened, doors opened, scholarships appeared, foundations formed. Her story became a bridge for others standing where she once stood. Years later, she would speak on stages across the world, always returning to that moment in the hallway, to the power of words shared honestly. Steve would keep a blurry image of that encounter, not because it looked good, but because it reminded him that success is measured in lives touched, not applause collected. Two strangers crossed paths in a quiet corridor, and in choosing to stop to speak and to listen, they proved that sometimes the smallest moments carry the greatest transformations.